early in Jane Austen's Emma, as the heroine and her young friend Harriet Smith discuss Robert Martin, the dutiful farmer at Abbey Mill Farm, Harriet inquires, "But did you never see him? He is in Highbury every now and then, and he is sure to ride through every week in his way to Kingston. He has passed you very often." Emma immediately responds, "That may be, and I may have seen him 50 times, but without having any idea of his name. A young farmer, whether on horseback or on foot, is the very last sort of person to raise my curiosity." When we read Austen's Emma, we often think about this exchange as one way to understand the heroine's rather privileged sense of usefulness to others within and around Highbury. As she explains to Harriet, "The yeomanry are precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. A degree or two lower and a credible appearance might interest me. I might hope to be useful to their families in some way or other, but a farmer can need none of my help." I think it may be safe to say that Emma's words sound a bit obnoxious to our modern ears, no? I mean, she essentially dismisses Robert Martin because he is not positioned in a high enough social sphere to merit her recognition, and he is not positioned in a low enough social sphere to merit her help, her charitable gifts, her notice. He lives and moves somewhere in between, a liminal space occupied by people with whom the heroine feels she can have nothing to do. While this exchange no doubt helps us think through Emma's conception of charity or usefulness, it also informs important features of the community of Highbury and its surroundings, a community that is at once small, compact, and experiencing important shifts that could destabilize the strict categories of its social system, allowing or even prompting more people to operate in such in-between spaces marked by uncertainty and transition. Harriet presents Robert Martin as one of these individuals in and around Highbury who, even though the heroine may not lend him much attention, participates in its community. As she explains to Emma, he is in Highbury every now and then, he rides through every week, and he has even passed you very often. As a resident of the Abbey Mill Farm, he may not live in the village proper, but he is involved in the Highbury community. He passes through, he is seen, he engages in commerce and interacts with others. He demonstrates that Highbury is connected to other sites and peoples. He is not a stranger or an intruder, but as the heroine makes clear, she does not recognize or know Robert Martin, even if she may have seen him 50 times. When we read Emma, Highbury can seem like an enclosed community in which every character knows every other character, but this is just not the case. And at this moment, Austen reminds us that Highbury is growing and changing. New people arrive and have arrived, some of whom incite disruption. It serves as an economic center for others who pass through. It has become home to numerous people who have risen and fallen in society. While it does seem to operate as a safe, stable, and functional community, Emma's rather privileged comment reminds us that Highbury is not merely a simple village. It is a cultural site in transition, and Austen may point to such transitions from the very beginning of the story. In the opening pages of the novel, Austen describes Highbury as a large and populous village almost amounting to a town. When I spoke to Dr. John Mullan, the Lord Rutcliffe Chair and Head of Department at University College London, he pointed to this exact passage.
I think in the first chapter of Emma, we're introduced to Highbury, and doesn't it say something like village, almost a town, village, almost a small town? And you can see it has to be a bit more than a village because it's got to have shops and butchers and an attorney at law and all sorts of things. But that's actually, once you sort of probe it a bit, Jane Austen never does anything thoughtlessly, carelessly. And that's important because you might think, okay, a village is a place where everybody knows everybody. The village of Chawton, where Jane Austen lived when she wrote these novels, would have been a place where she didn't know as friends or acquaintances necessarily, but she probably would have known the face and name of everybody there. A town's not kind of quite like that. So it's as if early on she wants to insert this uncertainty about whether it really is this tightly knit place, that that Mr. Woodhouse would like it to be, which is just, a very small number of people who all of whom he knows and none of whom ever change or go anywhere. Yes? Sort of a village of the ossified. Or is it a town where people come and go, and it's quite near London, and, people are sort of going off to Kingston on Thames to the market every week, and actually it's a place with a commercial life of its own, where there are always going to be outgoers and incomers. Is it that kind of place? And I think Austen wants you not to be quite sure which it is.
As Dr. Mullan makes clear, Highbury is a location in a bit of flux, and Austen's decision to frame Highbury as a transitional space in between a village and a town informs the entire novel. Highbury is most assuredly no longer the kind of community imagined by men like Mr. Woodhouse. People like Robert Martin pass through on business. Others, like Mr. Woodhouse's daughter Isabella, marry and depart for London. Poor Miss Taylor, the heroine's former governess, weds a successful businessman and assumes a new role. New residents have moved to Highbury. At times, even disruptive people appear. And Emma and others attempt to make sense of it all. Austen foregrounds these fluctuations and uncertainties in the community of Highbury, uncertainties that are so very important to how we come to know the people and places of the novel. Austen's Emma depicts the complexities of living in a community, and ultimately, the narrative reminds us that living in a community is replete with challenges. We seek out and participate in communities in part because they provide meaningful support, and they do, no doubt, provide so much for us. They help us connect with others, and they help us build understandings of who we are, where we come from, and how our identities may evolve. But Emma reminds us that communities are also complicated, dynamic, even fragile. Communities don't just appear, we make them. And for them to survive, we must sustain them, provide resources, address problems, and perhaps most importantly, tend to the needs, desires, and changing priorities of different members of a community. In this episode of Jane Austen and the Future of the Humanities, we turn our attention to these challenges of living in community. Challenges that most certainly bring opportunities as well. Of Austen's 6 completed novels, Emma is the narrative that devotes the most attention to this concept of community, to its makeup, its uncertainties, and its future. The novel details community events, integrates various social classes, and illustrates how and why new additions to the community may cause disruption or even chaos. When we study the humanities, we learn to value the importance of community, or perhaps more accurately, we learn to value the importance of various kinds of communities, including communities experiencing transition. We learn that communities are diverse, constituted by different kinds of people, prompting different kinds of relationships and engendering different kinds of problems. We learn, as the great Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams suggested, that the organic community that many often idealize, a community in which disparate individuals and components naturally come together and stay together because each member is valued and integral, may never have really existed. Instead, we create and recreate communities, and these processes create challenges and complexities. And in the humanities, we learn that communities evolve, at times due to massive disruptions, at times because they become more expansive and complex, and at times because of mundane incidents. In this episode of Jane Austen and the Future of the Humanities, I address the ways in which Austen's Emma invites us to think through these challenges of living in community, a vital humanities experience that we engage throughout our lives as we navigate disparate communities, seek to repair damaged communities, welcome new additions to our communities, and work to involve ourselves in new or evolving communities. My name is Michael Cramp, and I'm a faculty member in the English department at Lehigh University. And ever since I read Jane Austen at age 18, I've been pretty much enamored of her narratives, her characters, and her ideas. While many are repeatedly drawn to Austen for her famous stories of romance or the quaint settings of her fiction or her wonderfully witty language, I have found myself returning to Austen as both a scholar and a fan because of the ways in which she treats cultures, people, families, communities, relations, and other human phenomena as complex realities that merit and in turn invite careful, considered, and continual thinking. Austen invites us to keep thinking and keep learning. Before we return to Emma, I want to reflect a bit about why we care about community, both within and beyond the university. Many scholars in different academic disciplines discuss theories and concepts of community, from biology to political science to civil engineering to religion. We may talk about community differently, but scholars uphold community as an important feature of our lives and our futures. Universities also love to talk about their campus or student community, a community of alums, or even a larger international community. And in numerous spaces outside of the university, from our religious lives to our professional careers to our friends and families, we operate in community. We want it and we believe it matters for meaningful lives, but we may not always pay much attention to the complex challenges of living in, maintaining, and repairing community. The prominent Anglo-Irish political thinker Benedict Anderson famously introduced the concept of an imagined community to study nationalism and nation-building processes. He discusses, for example, how what he terms print capitalism allows for different kinds of media to knit people together, fashioning shared understanding or even common assumptions. For Anderson, the nation functions as an imagined political community. As members of a nation, we know relatively few of our fellow citizens, but we imagine ourselves in community, and both this imagining and this community are so very powerful that, according to Anderson, we become willing to fight, kill, and most importantly, die for what he identifies as such limited imaginings. Anderson develops his ideas to discuss nationalism and the nation-building process, but his theories may help us to consider both the power and the processes of community. We don't necessarily know every member of our communities, but our communities allow us to imagine connections. We form communities because we believe we share commonalities with others. And this process often involves imaginings. We often sustain our communities by imagining a future together. At times, we even imagine the past or origin story of our communities. Our communities are quite real, but they also require imaginative work. In Austen's Emma, we come to appreciate the making and remaking of community. It's a process that requires creativity and ongoing attention. And when I spoke with Dr. Janet Todd, Honorary Fellow of Newnham College, Cambridge, she spoke with me about the foundations of any community and pointed to some of the complexities in Emma.
Well, I think she shows that how you've got to rein yourself in to make a community, how you're going to have to think about other people, try to think what they're thinking. And that's what all the way through Jane Austen. She shows us that there are other consciousnesses outside our own and that we should try to understand them. And Emma can't. And she never can. And she never will, completely. And that's as far as you can. You learn to understand yourself by seeing how you're interacting with other people.
I think Professor Todd's comments are crucial to any discussion of building, imagining, or sustaining community. As she suggests, if we are going to participate in a community, we will need to rein ourselves in and think about other people and what they're thinking. And it's so terribly important to emphasize that the work that she outlines here is just not easy. This work requires us to try to imagine the lives, desires, and needs of others. It's not always easy to think about other people or restrain our own interests. To operate within community, as Professor Todd indicates, requires an understanding of our relationships to people beyond ourselves, people who are fundamentally different from us. We may need others and they may need us, but it's challenging to imagine these needs and balance them with our own interests. And I think it's safe to say that in our contemporary neoliberal societies, in which we have been trained to operate as independent economic machines, this has become even more challenging. In her award-winning book, Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, Wendy Brown discusses the rise of neoliberal societies and logics. We are everywhere Homo economicus and only Homo economicus. She explains how the neoliberal Homo economicus takes its shape as human capital seeking to strengthen its competitive positioning and appreciate its value, rather than as a figure of exchange or interests. As individuals, we now operate within a cultural logic that trains us to strengthen our own human capital, to ensure competitive positioning, and increase or appreciate our value. This neoliberal logic, as Brown makes clear throughout her book, inhibits democracy and democratic institutions. At its core, this neoliberal logic inhibits community. Neoliberalism instructs us to focus on our own economic goals. It tells us that we do not need others, and we certainly don't need to imagine our connections with them. We are individual economic machines, and our one priority is to become more productive economic machines. We might see early indications of neoliberal logic in Austen's Emma, and we no doubt observe the importance of community, as well as various threats, anxieties, and shifts that could disrupt community. As Professor Janet Todd suggests, in any community, including the community of Emma, we will need to think about others. Neoliberalism has discouraged us from engaging in such imaginative processes, and our modern appreciation for and investment in community has suffered. We may still recognize that community is important or valuable, but we now struggle, to borrow from Professor Janet Todd, to think of others, to rein ourselves in, and to devote the time and energy to sustain communities. When we study humanistic disciplines like literature or philosophy or history, we consider the formation of different kinds of communities, the importance of such communities, and the inevitable fragility, even vulnerability, of all communities. We learn how we often create, imagine, and sustain communities through the stories that we write, the music we sing, the questions we ask, the traditions or creeds to which we adhere, or the accounts of the past that we uphold. We learn that communities come and go, and at times return. No community is permanent, and their sustainability is contingent upon the efforts of individuals. Perhaps most importantly, we learn how the sustainability of any community requires individuals to care for and value others, not as economic machines, but as people with integrity, needs, and desires. To study such processes is to study how and why we form communities. The humanities offer important methods for thinking about the challenges of living in community, and Austen can help us to recognize and appreciate such challenges. During my time in India, I spoke with Mahesh, author of The Polite Society, a reimagining of Emma set within the elite societies of Delhi. Mahesh spoke with me about both Emma and his own treatment of the novel, but he first spoke with me about Austen and the importance of her work for both the humanities and the development of community.
I think the first thing I'd say is that, it's often said amongst, practitioners of the humanities or people invested in the humanities that there's a kind of empathy that evolves from being in these fields. And I disagree with that. I think there isn't a natural connection between say reading or reading these sorts of novels or the humanities in general and a kind of empathy. I don't think there is a direct connection there. But what I would say is I think that there can be understanding. There is certainly, looking at the novels of Austen, there are certain things she does. And I came to these students I came to these books not as a student of literature. I've never studied English literature, so this has never been taught to me. It's stuff I've had to kind of slowly work out for myself, through reading and rereading. But gradually I've discovered technically what Austen does. And one of the things she does is free and direct style, which famously she pioneered, which is basically paraphrasing, one character's view of another, which is sort of paraphrased. It's as close as you can get to the other character without actually inhabiting their minds. But it struck me that this is basically what we do in so much of discourse and interaction and conversation and gossip. It's mimicry. And what Austen is showing us is how we relate to each other in a very, very normal way, but putting it on the page. And I think that's why we respond so instinctively. She's showing us how we interact with each other as community.
Mahesh prompted me to think about my own scholarship and teaching, and I think he's absolutely right about empathy in the humanities. In my 30-plus years of teaching at the university, I've never been convinced that the material we teach in the humanities or the scholarship we write promotes empathy. I acknowledge that plenty of my colleagues will disagree with me, but I don't think courses in religion or language or art offer us instruction in how to share in the feelings of others. I've never been convinced that we step into the shoes of another by studying literature or history. I guess I don't believe that artistic representations or historical materials allow me to empathize with, connect to, or most importantly, know other peoples. Rather, as Mahesh Rao and Janet Hahn suggest, when we study such disciplines, we come to appreciate that others are fundamentally different from us. We are not the same. We think differently, and we have different goals and needs. But I do agree with Mahesh Rao that we can pursue understanding. And Austen is helpful in this process because she invites us to develop our sense of others through free and direct style. Austen provides us access to the thoughts of others, people who are not us and yet may still operate in our communities, people with whom we might imagine a connection. Again, I think this process of recognizing, appreciating, and navigating the differences of others is essential for any community and inevitably becomes a key challenge of living in and sustaining communities. Dr. Claudia L. Johnson spoke to me about Austen and community through the famous 1995 update of Emma, Amy Heckerling's brilliant film, Clueless.
Well, let me put it this way. I think Clueless is a brilliant reading, of Emma, in that it shows how any community generates its own groups, subgroups, and hierarchies, and that these are legible by clues. The clues are who your friends are, how you would dress, how you speak, what you read, what your antecedents are. And no group of people, to my knowledge, does this as expertly and viciously as high school students, But it's also what happens in Emma, where we see, as you mentioned, all of these groups, these levels. Everybody has their own levels, and to what extent are the levels mobile?
High school films can teach us so much, no? And as Dr. Johnson makes clear, all communities generate categories and subgroups that serve to order the hierarchy of a community. We can detect and identify different members of a community through clues or traits that, as Dr. Johnson reminds us, serve to structure the working of a community. We rely on such clues to negotiate the people of our communities. When these clues or markers become less certain, it's often a sign that the community itself is changing. And in these moments of transition, to recall Dr. Johnson's words, we often ask, to what extent are the levels of a community mobile? This question of mobility within a community underlies so much of Austen's Emma, a novel in which characters have risen and fallen within the social system, others develop and showcase new, at times unsettling ambitions, often finding themselves in uncertain or in-between social spaces, and still others work to reestablish the strict boundaries of a past order, an order that may be atrophying. But it's also a novel in which we observe how we form social groupings and subgroups, not unlike high school, and perhaps not unlike any community. Again, Dr. Claudia Johnson.
So I kind of think that the novel is about status and how you get it. The question the novel poses is, does it affirm that some people just have it? Or does it say that this whole process of having it is really problematic? Does Emma have it, or does she just want to have it? Is Emma as much of a pretender as Mrs. Elton?
Status, or the performance of status, is vital to our participation in any community, and This is certainly true of the community of Emma, but as Dr. Johnson indicates, people can perform status. We can often pretend to have it. And such performances allow people to transgress groupings or categories and remind us of the precarity of community. When I traveled to New Zealand, I had the privilege of speaking with Sam Brooks, a tremendous playwright and journalist who created M, a queer adaptation of Emma for the stage. This was one of my absolute favorite interviews of the past year, as Sam showed up with a bottle of local Sauvignon Blanc wine and explained, "This is what people in New Zealand do." I definitely want to go back to New Zealand. Sam spoke with me about this issue of community in both Austen's novel and his adaptation.
In terms of text, I think what at least my version of M captures is just community is messy, but I mean, at least my version of Emma is a comedy of manners. It's essentially everyone except Emma, and even M to an extent, understands, but everyone except M is allowing certain levels of behavior. And that is kind of the I think it is the beauty of that show. It's Miss Bates is allowed to be as ridiculous as Miss Bates is. M is allowed to be as ridiculous as M is. Mr. Woodhouse is allowed to make the silly jokes he makes. And it's about all of these people just allowing a certain level of that's how you are, but also that's how you want to be.
I want to connect Dr. Claudia Johnson's discussions of status and the pretension of status with what Sam identifies here as the messiness of community and the kinds of behavior we allow in community. In community, we are inevitably going to encounter some challenges and complexities. And as Sam notes, we also learn to tolerate certain behaviors, even pretentious behaviors that may seem odd or even ridiculous. But communities also inevitably set limits. As we observe in Emma, disruptive performances, secret relationships, and unknown lineages, legacies, and connections can cause serious problems, especially when people do not really know or value others. Communities are most assuredly messy, and most of our communities, I imagine, involve people whose behavior we might at times assess as silly or difficult or even annoying. In strong communities, we learn to tolerate or even value such members. Remember, not everyone is like us. People are fundamentally different, and at times we struggle to embrace such difference. As we build, rebuild, and imagine communities, we learn to manage this mess and mitigate the disruptions that could destroy our relations. We learn that the differences of others are integral to community. As I suggested at the beginning, it may be tempting to conceptualize the community of Emma as small, tightly knit, and restrictive, and at times we may even view this community devoid of serious problems or challenges. I don't think we are at all crazy to think in these ways. The plot or activity of Emma, unlike Austen's other novels, remains within a rather specific locality, that large and populous village almost amounting to a town. As we read the novel, people appear connected or even tethered to one another, and Emma, as a heroine, often seems to dominate or even determine the happenings of the novel. The world of Emma, as Dr. Jennie Batchelor notes, often appears massively confined and claustrophobic.
Somehow that, sometimes claustrophobic, that spatial confinement of that novel in particular. I mean, all of her novels are confined in certain ways, but I think that sort of absolute geographical confinement in Emma does allow her, as a writer, to shine the light on the really complex dynamics of community and what holds a community together, or conversely threatens to rip it apart.
Dr. Batchelor very eloquently identifies a tension at the heart of the community of Emma and our sense of its confinement. The spatial, sometimes claustrophobic limitations of the novel help us to appreciate the workings of the community. We observe, for example, the ways in which Miss Bates's seemingly inexhaustible ability to talk and share information sustains this community, or how the heroine's sense of privilege and resentment toward newcomers may threaten to tear it apart. During my conversation with Dr. Batchelor, she returned to this idea of claustrophobia in the novel and invited us to keep thinking.
Sometimes when I teach Emma, students find it, well, that word claustrophobia, which is often used to describe the novel, is something that a lot of my students feel intensely. But I think one of the things that's so interesting about it is, in fact, it's also one of her novels which gestures, I think, much more frequently and insistently to the bigger world outside that community, all the outside pressures, whether it's a reference to the post office and letters that are coming from elsewhere, whether it's the gypsies who are going to come in and so discombobulate Harriet. But there's also, and it's also a novel that in some ways has much more of a kind of much more of an obvious social awareness than other of her novels, because we get farmers and we get the many visits to the poor in the community.
The community of Emma is quite complex. It certainly may seem claustrophobic to readers, especially when we consider how the heroine meddles in the lives of others, or the ways in which people are constantly bumping into others at Ford's or elsewhere. But the community of Highbury may not really be all that isolated. As Dr. Batchelor points out, it's connected by letters and visitors and trips. As a novel, Emma gestures to the world outside, and Austen invites us to observe the challenges we experience as we attempt to maintain or order a community, and the ways in which a community might be threatened or even dissolve. One of these challenges that the narrative documents is ongoing and imminent change, including a shifting social order and new liminal spaces with which members of the community must come to terms. But the novel also presents the heroine as ignorant of or resistant to change, augmenting our experiences of confinement and claustrophobia. As a heroine, Emma is, of course, integral to this community. She's actively involved in every chapter of the novel save one. And in that one chapter, Mr. Knightley and Mrs. Weston rather obsessively talk about Emma. Emma's dominance in the narrative no doubt compels us to experience the community of Highbury as small and restricted. We see the world through her perspective, a perspective that is severely limited. When I traveled to Brazil, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Julia Romeu, a scholar and translator who has translated numerous Austen novels, including Emma, into Brazilian Portuguese.
And I think it's also important the fact that Emma is the only heroine that never moves. She never goes anywhere, right? Elizabeth Bennet visits Charlotte and then goes on a tour with her aunt and uncle, and she gets to know the hero better in these places when she goes away from home. The Dashwood sisters, they have to leave home, then they go to London. Everybody sort of moves. Even Fanny goes away from Mansfield Park for a while, but Emma is very static. And she thinks she knows everything because, in fact, she's seeing very little of the world. So I think this is an indirect way of saying she doesn't really know anything. She's very clever, but she's ignorant. She hasn't had the opportunity to see the world. She hasn't had the opportunity to see anything.
Emma is, as Dr. Romeu notes, quite static, and I really appreciate how she connects the heroine's lack of mobility with her lack of knowledge. This lack of knowledge no doubt impacts how Emma navigates the community. I want to take a moment to consider the relationship between Emma's ignorance, and ignorance tied to her rather stagnant or even inert existence, and her immense privilege. And I think it's important that we think about this issue alongside what Dr. Batchelor identifies as the larger dynamism of the Highbury community. Austen directs our attention to Emma's rather distinctive status from the very beginning of the novel, when she informs us that Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. The narrator emphasizes the remarkable contentment of Emma, whose dominant traits, handsome, clever, and rich, bring together some of the best blessings of existence. I think it's worth reflecting on just how remarkable her existence has been. At age 21, the heroine has simply had so very little to distress or vex her. Throughout her first 21 years, she has simply not had to manage difficult changes or deal with disruptive intrusions or overcome meaningful challenges. And let us not forget, this 21-year-old woman has lost her mother. Still, life for Emma has indeed involved some of the best blessings of existence. The community of Highbury, however, is marked by change, and not even the handsome, clever, and rich heroine can control or suspend such dynamism. but her rather blessed existence may inform her inability to appreciate the gifts, needs, and concerns of others. She seems to have it all. And when you have it all, or imagine you have it all, it's challenging to see why you might need others, care about others, or even bother with the changes going on around you. John Mullan helped me to think through this relationship between Emma's dominance as both a character and narrative focus and the novel's treatment of the larger community.
Emma is the Jane Austen novel in which a community is most present and makes the most difference. However, it's also a novel in which most of the time we are seeing things from Emma's point of view, and she is failing to notice or hear what that community is saying or might be thinking. And of course, this is a novel about self-absorption, and so Emma doesn't notice. So it's a wonderfully subtle, I think, sense of community you get from the novel, because you get it almost despite the heroine rather than through her.
Emma does not recognize all the complex happenings and developments in the narrative, but Austen invites us to see them if we are willing to listen to others, including, of course, the talkative Miss Bates. We may not learn to appreciate the community of Highbury through the heroine, but rather, as Dr. Mullan notes, in spite of the heroine. Emma is not very adept at recognizing the changes and shifts amongst her neighbors. She does not handle newcomers very well, and as we discussed earlier, she follows a rather rigid guide for relating to others, including those who are below her notice or operating in liminal spaces. But Austen also uses her heroine to dramatize the challenges of living in Highbury, including changes to the social order, newcomers and visitors who could unsettle ostensible contentment, and even the mundane shifts or instabilities that Emma just doesn't recognize. At almost the midway point in the novel, Austen narrates a memorable scene that may help us to think through Emma's understanding of her community, a scene that several scholars have suggested may be exceptional in Austen's corpus. We find Emma and Harriet at a central Highbury location, a village store commonly known as Ford's. Harriet, tempted by everything and swayed by half a word, was always very long at a purchase. And while she was still hanging over muslins and changing her mind, Emma went to the door for amusement. Much could not be hoped from the traffic of even the busiest part of Highbury. Mr. Perry walking hastily by, Mr. William Cox letting himself in at the office door, Mr. Cole's carriage horses returning from exercise, or a stray letter boy on an obstinate mule, were the liveliest objects she could presume to expect. And when her eyes fell only on the butcher with his tray, a tidy old woman traveling homewards from the shop with her full basket, 2 curs quarreling over a dirty bone, and a string of dawdling children round the baker's little bow window, eyeing the gingerbread, she knew she had no reason to complain, and was amused enough, quite enough still, to stand at the door. A mind lively and at ease can do with seeing nothing, and can see nothing that does not answer. She looked down the Randalls Road, the scene enlarged, 2 persons appeared, Mrs. Weston and her son-in-law. They were walking into Highbury, to Hartfield, of course. They were stopping, however, in the first place at Mrs. Bates's, whose house was a little nearer Randall's than Ford's, and had all but knocked when Emma caught their eye. As a general rule, I don't like to cite such lengthy passages from Austen in my podcast, but I think it's quite important that we consider this event carefully. We see Emma within the busiest part of Highbury, or more accurately, we see from the perspective of Emma the happenings and people and interactions of the busiest part of Highbury. And what we see appears so mundane, so basic. Mr. William Cox letting himself in at the office door, and a stray letter boy on an obstinate mule, or the butcher with his tray, or 2 curs quarreling over a dirty bone, and a string of dawdling children eyeing the baker's gingerbread. This scene may remind us of the claustrophobia to which Dr. Jennie Batchelor refers, and yet the mundane or even banal quality of this moment may point to some of the great complexities of living in community. Living in Highbury, like living in any community, can be quite basic. Daily life is often ordinary or even routine. Emma lives amongst the people she observes, and Austen informs us how the heroine's view of this village scene left her with no reason to complain and amused enough. The narrator memorably concludes, "A mind lively and at ease can do with seeing nothing, and can see nothing that does not answer." This scene may remind us of Austen's opening description of the heroine, who had very little to distress or vex her. But Austen reveals that Emma is short-sighted, even wrong about this moment outside Ford's. She does not see nothing. She sees the daily life of Highbury. This is what people do. Lawyers go to their offices, healthcare workers move quickly from one patient to another, kids admire freshly baked cookies, dogs vie for a bone. Emma fails to recognize the importance of daily life in Highbury. She fails to appreciate, as Raymond Williams theorizes, that culture is ordinary. And as Williams immediately adds, this is where we must start. While they may seem not terribly interesting, the activities she dismisses as nothing form the culture of Highbury. These ordinary moments, interactions, and desires shape the community. And Emma reveals both her ignorance and her inability to appreciate the dynamics of this changing community. Austen may immediately point to her heroine's failure when she reports how she looked down the Randalls Road, the scene enlarged, 2 persons appeared. I find this moment so very important because Austen makes clear that the scene is enlarging. New people are arriving, including Frank Churchill, who has been raised by his aunt and uncle after the death of his mother, and who maintains a secret engagement with Jane Fairfax, a secret that becomes quite disruptive to the presumed contentment of Highbury. While Emma may not have had much to vex or distress her throughout her first 21 years, changes are coming, the scene is enlarging, and the heroine may even have to learn to appreciate the ordinary lives, activities, and desires of people whom she assesses as nothing. In my conversation with Professor John Mullan, he spoke with me about a feature of the novel that may help us to make sense of both Austen's treatment of the everyday life of Highbury and its shifting community.
You know, I think it's the novel, Jane Austen novel, which mentions by far the most names of people that you never meet. And a lot of them come from Miss Bates, but not just from Miss Bates. So you're always hearing about people who you never hear and never meet. And they are part of this community.
Robert Martin apparently passes by the heroine on a regular basis. Unidentified boys carry letters. Women return home following a visit to the butcher. As readers, we learn of random people, often but certainly not exclusively through Miss Bates. These mentions of people we never meet help us to appreciate the dynamism, complexity, and challenges of community in Emma. Such people are part of the social system of the novel, and while we may not know them, they impact the community of Highbury, and even the heroine may have to interact with them. For many years, I've been fascinated by the way Emma involves 2 characters who are mentioned with some level of frequency, but whom we never properly meet, or who never actively appear on stage, so to speak. Mr. Perry and William Larkins. Emma's father, of course, continually praises Mr. Perry, and he's not the only one who seems to rely upon the apothecary. He is well known and respected in the Highbury community, but the scene in which he hurries by while Emma observes the people and events outside Ford's is the closest we get to actually seeing him in the novel. William Larkins, Mr. Knightley's steward at Donwell Abbey, may not enjoy the same respect and recognition, but he is likewise valued, indeed needed. Miss Bates praises William Larkins' generosity and refers to him as such an old acquaintance. Mr. Knightley apparently prefers the society of William Larkins to the possibility of a ball, and Emma even asserts that William Larkins will not like the prospect of his boss marrying the heroine. You must get his consent before you ask mine. As readers, we don't know Mr. Perry or William Larkins, but the community of Highbury most assuredly does, and the residents of this community rely on them on a day-to-day basis. They may be invisible, so to speak, but people like William Larkins and Mr. Perry are integral to the daily life of Highbury. Their absence from scenes in the novel may remind us that we just don't know everything about the rather ordinary workings of this community. People are developing relationships, impacting the social system, and inevitably adding to the complexity of living in community. I want to end this section with a comment from Dr. Jennie Batchelor, who spoke with me about the unappreciated, even unseen features that contribute to the social and political organization of community.
How many of the things that hold us together as communities, as groups of people, are invisible, and sometimes you only see the things that hold us together, that keep us civil, that keep us working together, that keep things harmonious. Sometimes you only see them and you see their power when someone transgresses those boundaries and does something that they really shouldn't. And what that moment does is it makes visible to us, I think, as readers, some of the things that are holding the Highbury community together. And, Emma has to take that lesson from that moment, and we as readers are invited to think about how we might navigate those similar kind of structures within our own lives and communities, I think.
We may not always recognize or appreciate how communities work. When we are living in or benefiting from community, it's quite easy to assume these structures, resources, even people, or maybe we take them for granted, but we notice them when they're gone or disrupted. As a novel, Emma reveals a community in transition. And as we observe the challenges of this transition, we come to recognize the integral importance of these invisible features, including some of the characters we never get to meet. Emma may be a privileged and dominant character in the narrative, but she is not the community of Highbury. Like everyone in Highbury, Emma is going to have to adjust to some changes. This is indeed one of the great challenges of living in community. When we study the humanities, we explore this challenge of living in community, and we learn that communities are dependent upon our abilities or lack thereof to value others. We learn that other people are fundamentally different from us. Their ordinary lives are different. They are motivated by different desires. They come from different backgrounds. We learn to look for these invisible structures or resources, even people, that help to stabilize a community. And we learn to pay close attention to those disruptive or unsettling forces that could threaten a community. While Emma does not appreciate all the dynamics of her community, others in Highbury are changing, relating to people in new ways, operating in liminal spaces, and reshaping social groupings. All this is happening regardless of how the heroine imagines her contentment or the blessings of her existence. Let's just think through a few quick examples. As I mentioned earlier, poor Miss Taylor marries Mr. Weston before the novel begins. Emma's longtime governess, a surrogate mother of sorts, definitively attains a new status. Mr. Weston is himself a former member of the militia who then engaged in trade and realized an easy competence, enough to secure the purchase of a little estate adjoining Highbury. Miss Bates is the daughter of Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, and as Mr. Knightley memorably reminds us, she has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. We have characters like Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, who perhaps are not proper residents of Highbury, but are certainly part of the Highbury community, and Frank and Jane have both enjoyed privileges, or at least opportunities, through their adopted families. And then there's Harriet Smith, the natural daughter of somebody, who had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of a scholar to that of a parlor boarder. Harriet's unknown familial background is one of the mysteries of Emma, and the heroine is determined that the young woman's soft blue eyes and all those natural graces should not be wasted on the inferior society of Highbury and its connections. Emma's relationship with Harriet is central to the plot of the novel, and the heroine's own efforts to introduce Harriet to the best of Highbury society remind us of the possibilities for mobility in this community. Men and women are rising and falling, individuals leave and return, others develop new, perhaps threatening ambitions, and people adapt to new experiences. Dr. Jennie Batchelor spoke with me about these changes, how such changes engender challenges for living in community, and Emma's own task of discerning her place in an evolving society.
And Emma thinks she's got this sussed at the beginning of this novel. She thinks she knows her place and she thinks she knows how she fits in it. But of course, communities don't change. Villages do turn into towns. The wider stage, national stage, global stage, is constantly evolving. People are coming in and out. The political context is changing. And we're sort of aware of this happening on the margins of the novel. And she has to work out what place for her in that world.
Emma has to work out her place, a place about which she seems to have both certainty and a degree of comfort at the beginning of the novel. As Austen depicts more changes, intrusions, and even disruptions within the community, Emma's task becomes much more difficult. Austen documents one of the great challenges of living in community when the Coles announce their plans to host a dinner party and invite some of the regular and best families. Austen handles the scene carefully. This was the occurrence. The Coles had been settled some years in Highbury and were very good sort of people, friendly, liberal, and unpretending. But on the other hand, they were of low origin in trade and only moderately genteel. On their first coming into the country, they had lived in proportion to their income, quietly keeping little company, and that little inexpensively. But the last year or two had brought them a considerable increase of means. The house in town had yielded greater profits, and fortune in general had smiled on them. With their wealth, their views increased, their want of a larger house, their inclination for more company. They added to their house, to their number of servants, to their expenses of every sort, and by this time were, in fortune and style of living, second only to the family at Hartfield. The Coles may epitomize the changing Highbury community. They have moved to Highbury rather than having been born or settled in the village. They were of low origin and only moderately genteel, and they are aspirational, adding to their house, to the number of servants, to their expenses of every sort. They now mingle with other social groupings, and to recall Dr. Claudia L. Johnson's comments, they now showcase some of the clues or markings of a higher social order, allowing them to adopt or perform a certain status and operate differently in the community. Austen shares Emma's reflections on the Coles and their planned party. The Coles were very respectable in their way, but they ought to be taught that it was not for them to arrange the terms on which the superior families would visit them. Emma's language reveals her privilege and ignorance. She wants to teach the Coles to respect an established social order. She wants to remind, indeed instruct, the Coles about both their place and the positions of others, especially those superior families. But the snag, of course, is that the Coles do not initially invite her to their party. When I spoke with Dr. Claudia L. Johnson, we discussed this scene and the Coles' decision.
Yeah, and that's the slap in the face because, they would never consider inviting her. Partly because they don't like her, and partly because the levels being what they are, it's not appropriate that she be invited.
As Dr. Johnson suggests, the Coles know and may actually respect a social order of sorts. They know that it would be inappropriate to invite Emma, and they don't. And their decision disrupts the heroine's plan. She felt that she would like to have had the power of refusal. Dr. Julio Romeu also spoke with me about this moment in the novel.
I think it's also what you said about the community changing is very interesting because we see that Emma is very snobbish, right? I think this is the reason why a lot of people don't like her. The whole business with the Coles are going to have a party. And for the first time, they are daring to have a party. And are they going to invite Miss Woodhouse, the crown jewel of Highbury? And she decides she's not going to accept, obviously. And but then the invitation doesn't come. And she starts to get nervous because she wants to have the power to refuse. She doesn't want to just not be invited.
Emma does appear as a bit of a snob here. And I want to specifically consider for a moment Dr. Romeu's comment about the heroine becoming nervous. Why is Emma, that handsome, clever, and rich woman who has had very little to distress or vex her, made anxious by this moment? Why should she care? Why not simply disregard this matter and forget about the party? Dr. Jennie Batchelor helped me to address these questions and think through this prominent event in the novel.
It's not just that at the beginning of the novel Emma belongs in that community. I think Emma thinks she is Highbury. She is the Highbury community, and the sort of sense that it's not just that she's not invited, but that this sense that she. What place do you have if you don't have the place you thought you occupied at the beginning of this novel? I mean, she's so dislocated by this.
Dr. Romeu and Dr. Batchelor make clear how the Coles dinner party dislocates Emma. As Dr. Batchelor indicates, she is now left to question her place in the community. And all this time, she sort of thought she was the community. Emma is, of course, not the community of Highbury. And she repeatedly fails to recognize the complexities and dynamism of the village and its residents. She is made nervous by many of its changes, including newcomers like Mrs. Elton and visitors like Jane Fairfax, who prompt her to reconsider her own value and role in the community. But unlike Emma, who struggles to engage people who operate in liminal spaces or embrace the malleability of the social order, the loquacious Miss Bates has the distinct ability not only to welcome visitors and make sense of new developments, but to thrive under such happenings. Miss Bates is truly a remarkable figure, and I want to take a moment to consider how Austen introduces her in the novel. Quite early, we are told that Miss Bates enjoyed a most common degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. She had no intellectual superiority to make atonement to herself or frighten those who might hate her into outward respect. She had never boasted either beauty or cleverness. Austen casts Miss Bates as almost the opposite of Emma. Miss Bates is most assuredly neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Austen soon adds, and yet she was a happy woman, and a woman who no one named without goodwill. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most blessed creature, and surrounded with blessings and such an excellent mother and so many good neighbors and friends. Miss Bates is at once happy, loving, and integral to her community. She legitimately cares about other members of Highbury. She also knows things about people. She's connected and she's valued. As Austen concludes, the simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, her contented and grateful spirit, were a recommendation to everybody and a mine of felicity to herself. So, Miss Bates can also be annoying. In Austen's words, she was a great talker upon little matters, full of trivial communications and harmless gossip. Miss Bates knows plenty and is most willing to share her knowledge, and very much unlike Emma, who has difficulty seeing the importance of the daily lives of others, Miss Bates excels in seeing and discussing such quotidian or even banal matters with everyone. Miss Bates, in short, helps to develop and sustain community. Dr. John Mullan helped me think about Miss Bates and her many functions in Highbury.
And Miss Bates is a sort of incarnation of that, because no one listens to Miss Bates. But if only you listened to Miss Bates, you'd find out what's going on. Not that Miss Bates herself always exactly knows, but she reveals inadvertently herself some of the clues as to what people are doing and saying outside Emma's orbit.
As readers, we may not always carefully attend to the extensive commentaries of Miss Bates, but as Professor Mullan indicates, perhaps we should. She does not always reveal knowledge in the most straightforward manner, and some of her knowledge appears as gossip, but again, she knows things and she values others. She's a community builder. Dr. Jennie Batchelor spoke about Miss Bates quite eloquently.
Her integrity and her sort of sense of self is continued throughout the entire novel. She doesn't, the world around her is changing too, but she doesn't really need to change because she understands her place within the community. She's very respectful of everybody else within the community as well, even people who don't always treat her perhaps as well as they should do.
Miss Bates is neither handsome, clever, nor rich, but she both models a high level of integrity and remains respectful of others, perhaps reminding us how Dr. Janet Todd spoke about the foundations of communal life. Miss Bates, to recall Professor Todd's words, embraces others, and she is neither bothered nor threatened by difference or change. She is comfortable with her own altered position in society, and she welcomes others. She may, of course, be a bit too welcoming at times. I want to mention two more quick ideas about Miss Bates that help us to appreciate her great importance to Highbury and its sense of community. When Dr. Batchelor and I chatted, we spoke specifically about the community that Miss Bates facilitates in her own home.
And intergenerational. It's not just a horizontal female community of women of the same age, women coming together. I think that intergenerational aspect is really, really important as well. The respect that Miss Bates has for her mother, the respect that Miss Bates has for Jane, and I think that's a really important facet of that community as well.
In a small residence, she cares for her mother, welcomes and upholds Jane, and even successfully integrates Emma and Harriet when they visit. She is, again, a remarkable builder of community, and she knows that no community will sustain without change or development. She is not made anxious by the arrival of Jane Fairfax or Mrs. Elton. She does not become nervous or unsettled at the Coles dinner party. She values Robert Martin, Mr. Perry, even William Larkins. She can navigate all these people and changes, in part because she has a clear understanding of her own integrity and a consistent appreciation of others. Final thought on Miss Bates. I had an opportunity to speak with Laura Rocklyn, a historical interpreter, playwright, actor, and scholar who shared great ideas with me about Miss Bates and the community of Highbury.
And I think it's also a lovely community and speaks to Austen's wide appeal in that we have characters in the novel from Mr. Knightley at Donwell Abbey with plenty of disposable income, down to Miss Bates, who, is, as they describe it in the novel, slipping constantly ever further, trying to make ends meet, to take care of her elderly mother. Her niece is going to have to go out as a governess. This is a situation in which a number of Austen's other heroines could easily find themselves, were it not that they marry the right man at the end of the novel. The Bennets could end up there. The Dashwoods could end up there. And I think it's interesting to see sort of all of the different kinds of people that go into making up this community and that they all are part of making it work.
In all honesty, I don't think I had ever thought about Laura's idea that other women, including beloved heroines of Austen's corpus, could end up in a situation not unlike that of Miss Bates. But she's absolutely right, and Miss Bates's situation likewise could have been different. She could have occupied a different position in Highbury and developed very different kinds of relationships with others, but change happens, not everything works to plan, and new people arrive, and ultimately, no matter how hard we try to order or plan or imagine a community, it evolves. And throughout, Miss Bates remains vital to the interconnectedness and sustainability of Highbury. All communities are complex, and Austen repeatedly documents the challenges of living in community, challenges that affect everyone, from Mr. Knightley to Miss Bates, even Emma. In academic disciplines like history or religion, we learn to become attentive not just to significant social or political changes that make headlines, but more subtle, perhaps mundane shifts that impact how people live their lives. We learn to consider how ordinary people and seemingly basic events that may not end up in textbooks are integral to communities. In the humanities, we learn that the language we use, the questions we ask, and the stories we tell inform how we relate to others. We learn that different languages and different modes of communicating allow us to relate to people, to disseminate knowledge and collaborate. We learn that while people share plenty of experiences, including many experiences tied to daily life, they also have different, at times rather complex origin stories, or have experienced different kinds of changes. We learn that we can't prejudge or make assumptions about the communities in which we live, and we learn that we can't fix a communal order for perpetuity. We are going to need to listen to others, navigate changes, and even work through a few unsettling events, or maybe even learn to live and work with people who really frustrate us. Highbury may seem small or confined and strictly ordered, but it's also a community in transition, and transition often brings, or is at times even engendered by, disruption. In the final segment of this episode, I want to think through two specific examples of change, disruption, or even unsettling disturbances that make clear some of the challenges of living in community. And let's try to be clear about one thing. Disturbances happen. No community is perfect or perpetually stable. Families or workplaces or social groups that we might imagine as content or well-structured all deal with disturbances. Indeed, I think it's fair to suggest that one measure of a strong or healthy community is how it manages unexpected or even disastrous moments that inevitably challenge how we live in community. In Emma, Austen details at least two prominent disruptions: the arrival of Mrs. Elton, the former Miss Hawkins, and Harriet Smith's brief encounter with the Romani, commonly known as the Gypsies. We learn about Mrs. Elton's new wife well before she arrives in Highbury, and Austen's language may remind us of some of the kinds of changes affecting Highbury that we've already discussed. The heroine reflects, she brought no name, no blood, no alliance. We wait a bit to develop a fuller understanding of Miss Hawkins, but Emma identifies her origin story, and she's not impressed, even adding that it was not unfair to guess the dignity of her father's line of trade had been very moderate. And upon arrival, Emma quickly becomes annoyed by the ways in which Mrs. Elton operates in Highbury. Professor John Mullan talked with me about the entrance of Mrs. Elton and her relationships with Emma.
And and of course the great incomer, the most delicious, delightful, wonderful, welcome, but utterly ghastly incomer, Mrs. Elton, who is, who arrives in Highbury to tell everybody, to tell Emma about what Surrey is like, to tell her what it's like to live in Highbury, to tell her this, to tell her that, and to, fight the good fight in a way with her about who is going to be the queen. Who's going to be the Queen of Highbury? And one of the many, I think, hidden delights of Emma, which I only twigged, I don't know, on my 10th reading or something, is how, although Emma is right about Mrs. Elton is monstrous, gloriously monstrous. She is a sort of alter ego as well. And I remember when I began noticing how they use some of the same turns of phrase. They have some of the same boasts. That sort of, Mrs. Elton is kind of Emma with a twist, actually.
Professor Mullan points to an emerging conflict. Mrs. Elton wants to take on many of the same social roles performed by the heroine. And as Professor Mullan notes, they even use some of the same phrases. They both want to organize events and to orchestrate people. They both claim expertise and offer evaluations of people, their families, and their homes. And they both actively want to help young women. While Emma, of course, shows interest in the future of Harriet Smith, Mrs. Elton focuses her attention on Jane Fairfax. Austen tells us that Mrs. Elton took a great fancy to Jane Fairfax, and from the first, she must be wanting to assist and befriend her. Perhaps more importantly, she also explicitly encourages the heroine to join her efforts, exhorting, "We must exert ourselves and endeavor to do something for her. We must bring her forward." She soon adds, "A vast deal may be done by those who dare to act. You and I need not be afraid. If we set the example, many will follow it." Emma really struggles with the behavior of Mrs. Elton. She massively disrupts the ways in which the heroine understands Highbury. She is assertive, perhaps even aggressive in how she builds relationships. Even in her language, Mrs. Elton presumes a unity of sorts between herself and the heroine. We must exert ourselves. We must bring her forward. If we set the example. It's as though Mrs. Elton assumes that she and the heroine are already in community, already in collaboration, and already in agreement about the order and goals of the community. But Emma does not share Mrs. Elton's obsession with assisting Jane Fairfax or helping her prepare for a career as a governess. Indeed, Emma struggles with Jane Fairfax, a young woman with whom she has been perpetually compared since their youth. Mrs. Elton's determination to help Jane sort of bothers the heroine. Dr. Devoney Loser, Regents Professor at Arizona State University, spoke extensively with me about the role of Mrs. Elton in this novel, including her relationships with Emma and her affinity for Jane Fairfax.
And the part that I've enjoyed picking apart is what happens when Mrs. Elton comes in from outside the community and kind of messes things up. And the line that I really love and have used to try to make sense of Emma versus Mrs. Elton as two models of female power is the duty of woman by woman. And this is a line that is used to talk about Jane and Emma, but I think it also brings up Mrs. Elton. Who is doing the duty of woman by woman in that novel? If it's a novel exploring female power, then Emma sees what she's doing wrong by Mrs. Elton doing it even more wrong. And, that to me shows the way that someone from outside the community comes in and exposes the things that are a bit rotten in its own seemingly functional structure.
Professor Loser foregrounds the ways in which women in the novel struggle to support other women. Miss Bates is rather exceptional in how she fosters and sustains a community of women. And as Professor Loser indicates, Austen draws specific attention to Emma's own doubts about whether she had not transgressed the duty of woman by woman in betraying her suspicions of Jane Fairfax's feeling to Frank Churchill. The heroine overtly questions whether she is properly supporting other women in her community. This is significant for Austen and the heroine, who takes issue with how Mrs. Elton wants to build community with other women. Again, Professor Loser.
They're supposed to be friends. Emma's not exactly done that correctly. So Emma is worrying that she hasn't done the duty of woman by woman. But Mrs. Elton comes in and says, I am now going to be, Mrs. Benevolent, and I'm going to force my will on other people. And she forces her will on Jane, or tries to. Mrs. Elton is presented as a kind of liberal feminist. I'm going to come in, I'm going to do right by women, I've got these great ideas. And, she's fake. She's absolutely fake. This is all about her own selfishness.
I really like this idea of thinking about Mrs. Elton as a short-sighted liberal feminist, and Professor Loser's analysis of her arrival in Highbury helps us think through why such behavior is disruptive. Mrs. Elton selfishly pursues her agenda. She fails to listen to others, most prominently other women. She does not appreciate their distinct needs or desires. She assumes relationships that have not been built, and she is convinced that she is right and justified. To recall Professor Mullan for a moment, Mrs. Elton operates quite a bit like Emma. Mrs. Elton is quite unsettling for the heroine, and I think she helps us appreciate an additional challenge of living in community. Plenty of people, especially people with whom we share community, truly want to help and truly want to help others. But as Professor Loser makes clear, Austen's Emma exposes some of the complexities, even dangers of people's determination to help.
But I think this is really not recognized by a lot of people, the way that Austen is picking apart these kinds of bad feminist, bad actors, doing so within the supposed realm of bettering.
Emma and Mrs. Elton are both committed to helping other women, but they don't always read the room so well. Their resolve to help others is often more about their own egos, their own social projects, their own goals, rather than the actual needs of other women. As numerous feminist scholars have theorized, women have historically been central to communities, especially the sustainability of communities. Women operate not merely as the biological reproducers of a community, they also have traditionally served to connect people, transmit culture, and reproduce the cultural legacies of peoples and communities. Miss Bates, of course, is quite good at sustaining a community, even though she bears no children, and Miss Bates values female community. Mrs. Elton is disruptive, and her arrival helps us to appreciate both the challenge of integrating new members within a community and the potential risks of selfishly trying to help other members of a community, especially young women. When I discussed Mrs. Elton with Laura Rocklyn, she recalled her play, Emma is Presented in Washington City, performed at the 2015 Jasna AGM in Washington, D.C., and reflected with me on the role of women in building and sustaining community.
When I wrote my play about Emma, it was actually for the 2015 Jane Austen Society of North America AGM in DC. And one of the things that's always fascinated me about that era in Washington City is that the women there were in a young country creating rules for a new society and trying to sort of fashion a world that they wanted to live in. And so my imagined play, which was the curtain raiser for that AGM, was Dolly Madison, Betsy Bonaparte, Rosalie Steer Calvert, and Louisa Catherine Adams coming together to discuss this new novel, Emma, that had just been published in Philadelphia in 1816, and sort of looking at this depiction of a community in the old world and what from that they wanted to emulate, what they thought was not working so well. And I didn't really at the time set out for it to be a play about community, but when you asked this question, I started to think about it. It really was, because it was sort of them talking about, we're trying to create a world in which there aren't these class distinctions, but in which we are still here to support each other.
Laura's comments prompted me to rethink both the community of Emma and the vital role of women in forming community. The handsome, clever, and rich heroine is established in Highbury. Mrs. Elton arrives and actively involves herself in the lives of the same community. And as in Laura's play, these women determined to help and help other women, are going to need to consider the needs and hopes of other women. and maybe even learn to imagine together a future community. When I spoke with Professor Janet Todd, she offered a useful concluding thought about the challenge posed by Mrs. Elton.
And the irritation of having to live with Mrs. Elton, and yet the need to give something to them all. And I thought that's a huge thing to learn. It's enormous that other people exist as well as yourself. I think it's really very powerful.
Mrs. Elton is, of course, quite irritating. As we all know, plenty of people can be irritating, and we end up sharing communities with many of these people. In Emma, the heroine is going to have to live with Mrs. Elton in the same community. They will need to come to terms with the reality that other people exist. One way or another, they will come to terms with the reality that young women are not merely raw resources to be molded or changed or improved. They may even learn to appreciate each other. The second disruption that I want to consider is at once more profound and perhaps less memorable. The Romani appear very briefly in Emma in the third chapter of the third volume, when Harriet Smith and Miss Bickerton, another parlor boarder at Mrs. Goddard's, walk on the Richmond Road and about half a mile beyond Highbury suddenly perceived at a small distance before them a party of gypsies. We honestly don't learn much about the Romani. Their appearance in the plot is rather fleeting, and while they most assuredly interrupt the ordinary daily life of the village, we are told that the gypsies did not wait for the operations of justice. They took themselves off in a hurry. Harriet Smith and Highbury at large seem to recover from their encounter with the Romani, but they are a disruption, maybe even a threat, to young women and the order of the community, and the novel may ultimately present this disruption as functional. As we think through the disruption caused by the Romani, let's take a closer look at how Austen treats this scene. A child on the watch came towards Harriet and her friend, Miss Bickerton, to beg, and Miss Bickerton, excessively frightened, gave a great scream and, calling on Harriet to follow her, made the best of her way by a short cut back to Highbury. Harriet, however, had suffered very much from cramp after dancing, making her absolutely powerless, and in this state, and exceedingly terrified, she had been obliged to remain. The narrator immediately questions. How the trampers might have behaved had the young ladies been more courageous must be doubtful, but such an invitation for attack could not be resisted, and Harriet was soon assailed by half a dozen children, headed by a stout woman and a great boy, all clamorous and impertinent in look, though not absolutely in word. The Romani don't just disrupt Harriet or startle her, they exceedingly terrify her. And the narrator informs us that she became more and more frightened. Several scholars have considered this moment in Emma, pointing out both the historical fears of and biases against the Romani throughout the 19th century. All this is quite real and important. The gypsies, no doubt, operate as a kind of cultural other in the novel. And yet they are a cultural other who exists just outside Highbury, about half a mile outside, in a location apparently public enough for safety, but which had led them into alarm. As we have learned about Highbury, this large and populous village, almost amounting to a town, is growing and changing. And while it is mostly populated by people who seem to interact with one another on a regular basis, Austen's inclusion of the Romani reminds us of both the dynamism of this community and its connection to larger national, even global contexts. Still, the Romani are clearly different from Emma, Mr. Knightley, and Miss Bates, and unlike Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, they are not even of Highbury. But again, we find them just beyond the village boundary. And while we never really learn that much about them, they may have a function within or for this community beyond merely frightening young women. I want to emphasize again that according to Austen's account, the gypsies just don't do that much, but they are disruptive and frightening. They beg for money, they appear all clamorous and impertinent in look, though not absolutely in word, and as the young woman's terror and purse were too tempting, she was followed, or rather surrounded by the whole gang demanding more. For quite some time, I've been interested in Austen's treatment of this moment and its disruptive quality, as well as the dearth of narrative details. We don't really know what the gypsies look like. We don't hear them speak, and Frank Churchill's serendipitous rescue of the young woman may actually receive more attention in the narrative. Emma and others cast this moment as an adventure, and the heroine reflects, "It was a very extraordinary thing. Nothing of this sort had ever occurred before to any young ladies in the place within her memory. No alarm of this kind." Harriet's encounter with the gypsies is extraordinary and anomalous, and other members of the community, including the heroine, quickly process and respond to the event. Let's consider this for a moment, and let's try to remember that the gypsies in the early 19th century were viewed as a distinct people that engendered both fear and mystery. Numerous laws targeted the gypsies, many merely for being gypsies, and they effectively operated outside the nation's mainstream culture and economy. So even though the stout woman and accompanying children don't do all that much, their presence is still disruptive, even terrifying, and it's not merely because they ask for money. As a cultural other, a site of cultural difference, the gypsies function as a threat to the community. They specifically operate as a threat to a young woman, a very pretty girl who was short, plump, and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of great sweetness. We often don't get extensive physical descriptions of characters in Austen's novels, and as I noted earlier, we don't really know what the gypsies look like, but we do get some important details about Harriet. Blue eyes, light hair, regular features. Harriet appears as a bit of the stereotypical young white woman, the kind of young woman that white communities will rely upon to reproduce a people and a culture. The gypsies may not really endanger Harriet, but they do scare her, and the community of Highbury is quick to address this disruption, calming and reassuring Harriet and securing her place in the community. Shortly after this scene, Mr. Knightley organizes a strawberry picking expedition to Donwell Abbey, an outing that Mrs. Elton memorably refers to as a gypsy party and even speculates about the possibility of arriving on donkeys. Upon arrival, Austen identifies the grand view of Knightley's estate. It was a sweet view, sweet to the eye and the mind. English verdure, English culture, English comfort. Donwell is a beautiful location marked by agriculture and comfort and safety. As Mr. Knightley tours Harriet around his verdant property, Emma reflects on the pairing. It was an odd tete-a-tete. In this place of English comfort, Knightley showcases his land and crops, and notably a favorable view of Abbey Mill Farm, worked by the same Robert Martin whose earlier proposal of marriage Harriet rejected, at the prompting of Emma. As we discussed at the start of this episode, in the beginning of the novel, the heroine claims she cannot identify Robert Martin as he passes through Highbury. But at this point in the story, Robert Martin most assuredly matters to the community of Highbury. And following Harriet's exceedingly terrifying encounter with the gypsies, Mr. Knightley invites the young woman to view the rich pastures farmed by Mr. Martin, the spreading flocks, orchard in blossom, and the light column of smoke ascending. The gypsies disrupt the community of Highbury. They frighten Harriet and unsettle her friends, but they also prompt Knightley and others to take steps to solidify her place and her future life in the community. Highbury is going to need young women like Harriet to operate as biological and cultural reproducers to imagine and sustain a future community. Mr. Knightley and Emma and others know this. They know that they cannot allow Harriet to become a wasted resource or operate like the gypsies outside of the nation's economy. Mr. Knightley knows Harriet will be safe and productive if she secures a future with Robert Martin. When I spoke to Dr. Patricia Matthew, director of the Race and Regency Lab, she pointed to this moment and invited us to think more complexly about its function in the novel.
So my first thought was, and I thought thinking about the Romani and what they allow, right? They allow us to understand Emma. They should reveal her politics to us, right? Whatever we do with that is our own business. But they reveal who she is, like not just the least of these, but people who would be seen as other and as a threat, and her reaction.
The Romani indeed help us understand the politics and motivations of Emma, Mr. Knightley, and others. We learn that they are determined to integrate or reintegrate young women like Harriet. They cannot allow her blue eyes, light hair, regular features to be unproductive or fall into the hands of the gypsies. The threat of the Romani disrupts the community of Highbury, but this threat may also be functional as it prompts community leaders to secure the future of Harriet. In the humanities, we often discuss how disruptions, threats, and outsiders can be deployed functionally. Communities are going to experience disruption or unsettling additions or moments of uncertainty. And as we suggested earlier, one of the measures of a healthy community may be how it manages such disruptions. But Austen's treatment of the Romani invites us to consider not just how a disruption might be managed, but how it becomes useful. How disruptions prompt us, perhaps even force us, to build and rebuild communities. The otherness of the gypsies, in short, allows Mr. Knightley and Emma to claim Harriet as one of theirs and to verify that the gypsies are categorically not. Harriet will belong to Highbury, and her encounter with the disruptive gypsies makes this clear. Highbury needs Harriet, and when she is frightened and threatened, the community takes steps to reincorporate her in the present and the future. When we study disciplines like history or religion, we consistently consider how we form and reform communities. We learn how racial, national, gender, linguistic, and class outsiders actually become useful in forming a community. Courses in philosophy and language help us appreciate how we often need a concept or representation of an other to establish and sustain a unified community. We often don't know who we are as a community without designating people to exclude, like the gypsies. As the great Birmingham School cultural theorist Stuart Hall memorably reminds us, the English aren't racist not because they hate the blacks, but because they don't know who they are without the blacks. They have to know who they are, not in order to know who they are. The gypsies helped to define the community of Highbury. Who belongs, whom we will exclude, and how we will know the difference. When we study the humanities, we perpetually return to these questions. In the histories we discover, the stories we tell, and the questions we ask. Again, communities don't just happen. We make them and remake them. As Dr. Patricia Matthew explains, Austen's treatment of the Romani helps us understand the politics of Emma and others, a politics that certainly informs anxieties about the making and remaking of a community that is changing. But while Highbury experiences prominent shifts, its members also set some limits. When we study disciplines like literature, history, and religion, we inevitably consider how such politics can involve explicit racism, nationalism, patriarchal misogyny, and classism. And we often discover how such politics can be perceived as benign. When we study different cultures and traditions, we learn how communities use stories, language, and rituals to both build community and delimit boundaries. We are perpetually forming communities and groupings by demarcating who belongs and excluding who does not. In Emma, Austen helps us to appreciate how disruptions can actually aid such processes. The Romani are a disruption, even a threat, and disruptions are no doubt one of the great challenges of living in community. We learn to live with some disruptions, we learn to manage others, and we make use of others to advance our politics, but disruptions also remind us that we make our communities. We resource them and repair them. They are precarious and need to be sustained over time. If we don't care for our communities, they fall apart. If we restrict too tightly who can join our communities or how they might change, we can stultify their development. If we actively exclude people and ideas from our community, we can become elitist, separatist, or discriminatory, missing out on new ways of thinking and living, and missing out on opportunities to connect with other communities. Austen helps us to explore these ideas and invites us to consider both the foundational features of community and the challenges of living in community. Laura Rocklyn reminded me that Austen herself thought carefully about community, especially in Emma.
I mean, it's so interesting to focus on community in Emma, because much is often made of that quote from Austen giving advice to her niece Anna, who was an aspiring authoress, that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. Because Emma is really the only one of Austen's novels in which she actually sticks to that.
We may romanticize Austen's comments to her niece or make too much of her fiction writing advice, but Laura invites us to reflect on how Austen's ideas may evolve as communities like Highbury evolve. In Emma, Austen may have started out with 3 or 4 families in a country village, but Highbury is no longer a simple small village. Communities change and develop, and as they change and develop, we can observe more complexity, more richness, and more challenges of living in community. When I spoke with Vanessa Kelly, best-selling author of The Emma Nighthouse Mysteries, she helped me to synthesize some of these issues.
I guess the first thing I would say is that sometimes we don't realize how fragile our communities are. Like, we think they're solid. And certainly Emma thinks Highbury is solid. Highbury is her whole world. For every person in Highbury is probably their whole world. So, like I said earlier, everyone matters. As they say in the Harry Bosch books, everyone matters or no one matters. So everyone matters to some degree, to all degrees. But they're also fragile. These communities are fragile.
How do we ensure that everyone matters? When we live in community, what can we do to make certain that we value the integrity of other individuals, other subgroups, or even new members who might appear as disruptive or other? What happens to a community when it becomes perfectly clear that it doesn't want to value the integrity of other individuals or other communities? When we study the humanities, we learn that we need community. We want to live in community. We want to know others, allow others to know us. We want to integrate others into our lives, and we want to be part of the lives of others. But all these ambitions lead to serious challenges, especially as we navigate changes to our communities, new additions, even disruptions. As a novel, Emma allows us to explore both the great benefits and the great challenges of living in community. Austen invites us to see the foundational needs of a community and its fragility. She helps us appreciate the importance of community organizers and leaders and the difficulty of incorporating or welcoming new people. She reminds us that communities are dynamic spaces in which we cannot assume that people will remain static or simply stay in a designated place or part of one subgroup. We learn, to recall the words of Professor Janet Todd, that other people exist and matter. We need these other people, but we can't control them. They're different from us, and that's a good thing. I want to end with a comment from Dr. Vivek Sakdeva, a colleague from GGSIP University in Delhi, who has written extensively on film and adaptation studies, including filmic adaptations of Austen.
As a member of community, as a member of a society, we are constantly in some kind of dialogue with people around us. And that dialogue also leads to a dialogue with our own self. And that is how our self becomes a part of a larger community. It's not my individuality is so exclusive that people around me do not matter to me, or I do not matter to them. It's a constant engagement. It's a constant negotiation, which becomes the basis of our growth and evolution.
To live in community is to participate in this constant dialogue, to share part of ourselves with others, and to allow others to share with us. Austen offers us an opportunity to observe these processes of community, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Austen, as a cultural figure, also facilitates community. We build reading groups and viewing parties around Austen. We attend massive conferences and conventions, as well as smaller, more intimate events. We turn to Austen for inspiration, advice, even pointed guidance. And none of these communities are free from challenges. We are always participating in a dialogue between ourselves and others. One of the greatest experiences of study in the humanities is the recognition that we are simply not alone. Other people exist, other people are different, and other people have desires and needs that are different than us. Other people matter. To live in communities to acknowledge such differences and needs, and we don't always succeed. Indeed, in our extremist cultures of today, we often abandon community or create restricted, closed-off groupings. We often prejudge people by the clues we discern from their behavior. We quite often leverage otherness and cultural difference to fortify our communal identity. But as Austen makes clear, communities change, people come and go, and we all have to adjust, learning to re-engage in new and different dialogues between self and others. In the next episode of Jane Austen and the Future of the Humanities, we turn our attention to Persuasion, Austen's final completed novel to explore the question of happiness. We all seek happiness in one way or another, and our journeys are often inflected by questions of how best to find happiness, who or what might help us become happy, what kinds of academic disciplines or career trajectories will support our happiness. In my experience, college students take these questions and their answers quite seriously. But we don't experience happiness by following a script. As we know, the very concept of happiness is rooted in hap, what we come to understand as happen chance. We can strive to make all the right choices, choose the ostensibly best major, pursue the ideal internship, and seek the model mentor. But none of these choices guarantees happiness. We can't predetermine happiness. And in Persuasion, Austen shows us a vital humanities experience. Happiness is just not something we're going to script.